The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
Today we're going to be focusing on cost. So what is cost worth in an RFP? Now, we're going to introduce an equation here that cost, if it's ever worth more than 35%, essentially transforms the RFP process into a low bid event. And we're going to try to prove why this is the case. It might sound counterintuitive. Hey, only about a third of the RFP weight is cost. How is it low bid? Please let us explain. But first, we'll come right out of the gate and go with our big recommendation from CPE, which many of you have seen before. But our best practice is that cost should never be worth more than 35%. That also goes for pretty much any individual evaluation criteria. That's actually how we state it in our best practices, is don't put more than essentially a third of the weight for one criteria, or total weight on one criteria. So it's probably most importantly applied to the cost, the fee, the financial portion of the RFP evaluation. So we're going to spend the rest of the session here talking about why this is. And since it's in a nice equation format, I want you to warn you that we are going to try some science here to prove this thing. So stand back, we're going to dive in. And when you think of science, right, you might think of Newton getting hit in the head with the apple. Famously, that led to the law of universal gravitation, which states that the mass of two objects and the square of their distance will dictate the gravitational forces between them. That's through the gravitational constant G. And then you got Einstein coming along saying, yeah, that's all nice, but general relativity means that the space-time fabric warps depending upon where you are. So it's not so universal, Newton. In fact, here is an image of a black hole warping space and time around it. So Einstein says, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Newton, things change. There's nuance here in this universe. And there's laws everywhere, right? Scientific laws all over the place. There's the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of physics, the laws of astronomy, chemistry, geology, and so forth. Pick your favorite one. It's enough to make your head hurt. Now, this brings me to one important point. Procurement has laws too. And this is the law we're talking about today, that cost worth greater than 35% does in fact equal low bid. If you haven't heard of this before, maybe you've heard of this formula under its other name, which is the fundamental equation of cost evaluations. Dun, dun, dun. Now it's time to prove it. So we're going to go through two proofs here. We're going to go with a mathematical proof first. Then we're going to delve into the murky area of science known as psychology. So we're going to use two different proofs here to prove our formula. Number one, let's start with the mathematical side of things. Now, when we're going to invoke math, getting into mathematical proofs, I do want to give credit because math is not created. This formula is not created. It was discovered by intrepid explorers of Jeff, Jake, and Brian here at CPE. So we discovered this. And to prove it all out, we got to get out our pocket protectors now to prove a mathematical equation. So Jake, glad to see that you've got your pocket protector prepared for us here. Jeff is not off the hook either, nor am I. In fact, I'm crowned with the Nerd Squad badge. Let's get going to do some math here. Okay, so here's our equation on the whiteboard. We've got cost. If it's greater than 35%, it's going to equal low bid. We've got to prove this mathematically. As everybody knows, when you're about to prove things mathematically, you have to list your assumptions first. So there's two core assumptions behind this equation. Number one, we're going to discuss typical evaluation steps and kind of what we're assuming how the RFP process will unfold. So in your typical evaluation process, you get the proposal coming in up front across the vendor or supplier community, and there's a bunch of things that have to happen before you make your contract award or you get to that contract signature stage. The big piece of that, of course, is your evaluation period. In general, the typical evaluation period can be broken into 3 steps. First, determine that those proposals are in fact responsive and responsible to meet your requirements. You do that check. Then we'll typically go into the true evaluation of the written proposal contents, which can be an assortment of things, plus the cost. Usually that information will then be used to determine a short list prior to interviews or presentations, assuming that there are some interviews and presentations in your RFP. Usually the written piece up front and the cost are looked at ahead of time to then, or factored in ahead of time. There's lots of ways you can treat costs. That's beyond the scope of today. But that's reviewed ahead of time, then going into interviews and presentations, then all of that information comes together to select our top ranked proposer, supplier, vendor, invite them into our negotiation clarification periods and get that contract signed. So that's kind of the assumption one, is that in general, RFPs follow something according to this evaluation process, just in general, of course. So that's assumption one. Assumption number 2 is, let's discuss some common evaluation weighting schemes. So for a simple project that is important enough that you're going to do an RFP for, maybe you have the written proposal elements of that project at around 75% of the weight, cost is the rest. You might be looking at something like that. But for more common RFPs, your larger, your more complex projects, you'll often have presentations or interviews or demonstrations added on top of the written portion of the proposal. So you'll still have the written portion in there, and then you'll have cost in there. And I'm going to fix cost here at the precise value of 35% because that's part of our equation. And then you might see something along the lines of 35% split between presentations or interviews or demos, and then the written proposal itself. That's a pretty typical or a common evaluation weighting scheme. Of course, in reality, things toggle around and there's a bit of a range here, but I'm pushing costs to its max at 35% according to our recommendations and just kind of splitting things the rest of the way. So when you look at this table down below of just 3 really broad categories of evaluation criteria and their weights, I'm going to switch the table and make it into a pie chart that might look like this: the written portion, the cost portion, the interviews. Kind of get that into a pie chart form. So that sounds really good. Now let's go back to the whiteboard. Those are our 2 assumptions. Let's get into mathematical proof time now. So let me erase the board here. Hang on. Erase. Yeah, there we go. Man, look at those PowerPoint skills. There we go. Time to do the proof. Cost greater than 35% is greater than low bid. First, let's call back our pie chart. So generally something like that. And let's recall our evaluation period, something like this. Now, I'm going to focus in on step number 2 of our evaluation period, of going through the written and cost portion, or on our pie charts, these pieces over here. So in other words, we're going to hold off on considering interviews for now. So let's focus in on the pie chart. When you're looking here up front, you're making a shortlist decision prior to interviews, prior to demonstrations. You've got your written piece, you got your cost piece. What you might start to notice here is that the math just pops off the screen. This is a 50-50 split between cost and everything else on the written proposal evaluation side. And so what this is going to start to dictate is, if you have interviews and presentations or demonstrations worth somewhere around 1/3 of the evaluation, that leaves you with this chunk of the pie chart up front to make your shortlist decision based on. And then if it's 50-50 like this, cost becomes a majority element of the evaluation if you go anywhere beyond 35%. If you go anywhere beyond 35% in terms of total weight and you have a shortlist possibility in your RFP, you are now dominating the upfront process based upon cost alone. And the way that we'll look at it is like this. If the majority of your decision-making is based on price, then that's essentially low bid. I mean, if you're going to make the major decision and cut vendors out of consideration, maybe drop them off and not even invite them forward to interviews and demos, and you've got a majority weight on price, then it's essentially a price-dominated decision. So at that point, I mean, you may as well call it low bid. In the immortal words of the Backstreet Boys, quit playing games with the vendors' hearts and just call it low bid. We are not going to be able to pretend that our RFP process is something that it is not. If we're going to weight price so high, then you may as well just go all the way and do low bid. So with that, mathematically speaking, if you follow those assumptions, therefore, we have now proven that if cost is greater than 35%, you're essentially looking at low bid. And that's for most RFPs of moderate size that are going to include those evaluation elements. So that's the math. That being said, math may not convince all of you, and so we have to delve into psychology as well. This one's a lot quicker and a lot easier to prove. Just think about this. How do vendors react when you tell them that price is worth 50% of the competition or more? How do they perceive that, right? So vendors will typically look at that and say, man, that really just kind of looks like low bid to me. In fact, I've seen it in some cases where we've had price down at 10% and the vendors are still skeptical because they're thinking that the other 90% of the evaluation is going to come in at 89.9 points and 89.8 points and 89.7 points. In other words, we're just going to give them on the evaluation committee, we're going to give those proposals roughly the same score, which then defaults to price anyway. So if you've got that potential perception out there in the industry, even if you've got price down at 10%, imagine if you tell vendors this is worth 50% or more, depending upon the step of the process. So that brings us to CPE's recommendation, right? As we're trying to value this type of comment to the vendor community. Just think about the psychological value this has, is to be able to look at our vendors at the pre-proposal or pre-bid meeting and say, look, you are not a commodity to us. Cost is always going to be 1/3 or less of our decision making. We're not going to put all our eggs in that basket, right? So that's kind of the psychological value here in good relations with our vendors. That's why when you think about the spectrum of solicitation documents, on the left-hand side, purely low bid versus the right-hand side, purely qualifications based. If you think about the 35% maximum on price, that's always going to tip your RFP. If you're following this recommendation, it's always going to tip it a little bit more towards a qualifications-based focus, right? Is don't go beyond 35% or so on the pricing side. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do 35%. You can certainly do something less. You can scooch over a little bit more. But we are advocates at CPE for having a good, solid, justifiable cost competition. It's just a matter of weighting it appropriately is essentially the idea. So with that, this is a very valuable thing to be able to look the vendor community in the eye and be able to say, hey, you're not a commodity. It's always 1/3 or less on price. That has great psychological value. And yes, of course, there's math behind this as well. So with that, I hope that we have satisfactorily proven this equation, and we will open up for any questions. I see one question in the chat asking if the beginning of the presentation will be available. Yes, presentation will be recorded and available on the website, usually within a week or so. I found another stupid mathematical, physical cartoon, so I thought I would share it with you all as well. If there are no other questions on this, thank you for letting us hop on the whiteboard for one of these sessions. And I will now say that class is dismissed.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.